Welcome to Mr. Sleepy. Relax. Take a deep breath. And let's drift into tonight's story. The Lantern Maker's Rainy Night. Elias, the lantern maker, sat in his small, cozy workshop at the edge of a magical forest. He spent many nights here, making lanterns that lit up the paths for travelers and kept the darkness away. Each lantern he made held a little piece of his dreams, reminders of stories his grandmother told him about how light could guide lost people home. The warm glow from the fire made the room feel safe, and the half-finished lanterns around him shimmered with a soft golden light. The air smelled faintly of pine and stardust, making Elias think of cold winter nights and childhood memories. Outside, the rain pounded on the windows, drumming a rhythm that matched the wild wind, howling around the workshop. Whisker, Elias's black cat, was lounging on a stack of old blueprints, her tail flicking back and forth, showing her boredom. Elias remembered the time she had knocked over an entire jar of stardust, covering the floor in sparkles that took forever to clean up. The memory made him smile as he shook his head at her playful nature. He glanced at her and sighed, thinking, of course, she'd pick the one spot I need. Every so often, Whisker's green eyes glanced at Elias, as if making sure he noticed her, claiming her nap spot. Elias adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, which always seemed to have a smudge that wouldn't go away, and carefully threaded a strand of moonbeam into the frame of a new lantern. It shimmered under his fingers, glowing softly. A sudden, strong gust of wind rattled the windows, making the flames of the smaller lanterns jump and dance. Elias looked up and sighed, as if waiting for the ceiling to answer his silent worry. I really should have fixed those cracks last summer, he muttered. Whisker let out a small, disapproving meow that seemed to say, "You think?" Before Elias could respond to the cat, he felt a mix of amusement and exhaustion at the familiar chaos. Another problem caught his eye. Water was starting to drip from the corner where the ceiling met the wall. It fell steadily into a tin cup, adding a sharp, rhythmic plink to the sounds of the storm. Well, that's one more thing to fix, Elias said, with a small smile that only he and Whisker seemed to appreciate. He reached for an old rag, accidentally knocking over a jar of stardust. It spilled onto the floor, glowing faintly as it scattered. Great, Elias muttered, bending down as the stardust clung to his fingers and hair. Whisker watched with wide eyes, clearly amused. She decided this was the perfect moment to leap off her perch and weave around Elias's feet. He almost lost his balance, but caught himself just in time. chuckling despite the mess. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room. It was so sudden and unexpected that Elias almost dropped the lantern frame. The wind roared at that moment, as if telling him to hurry. Papers flew everywhere, and the smaller lanterns flickered out, leaving only the soft glow from the larger ones. Whisker's fur puffed up, and her eyes went wide with surprise. "Hold on," Elias called out, though he doubted the storm or whoever was outside could hear him. He stumbled to the door, his boots scraping against the wooden floor, and opened it. Rain and wind rushed in, making him shiver. A figure stood in the doorway, soaked and shivering, their breath visible in the cold air. "Come in before you're washed away," Elias said, stepping aside. The stranger's eyes shone in the dim light, a mix of determination and exhaustion. They nodded and stepped inside, and Elias quickly shut the door to keep out the storm. The workshop suddenly felt smaller with the stranger inside. Elias studied them as they pushed back the hood of their cloak, revealing a young face with tired eyes full of worry. Before Elias could ask their name, the stranger spoke. "I need a lantern that won't go out," they said, their voice steady but tired. "The forest is darker than ever, and I need to get through it." Elias nodded, but a familiar weight settled in his chest. It reminded him of all the nights he spent fixing broken things, trying to help others while carrying his own worries and memories of people he missed. This wasn't the first time someone had come to him for a lantern to light their way through the dark forest. But there was something about this traveler's look that felt different, urgent, and maybe even desperate. "Well," Elias said with a small smile, "let's start with some tea." The traveler blinked, surprised by the offer. They glanced at the kettle on the fire, steam rising from its spout. "Is it fresh?" they asked, looking at the old tin of tea leaves on the shelf. Elias chuckled, the sound warm and deep. "Fresh enough. Besides, we just need it to be warm, right?" He poured 2 cups without waiting for an answer. The traveler took theirs, holding it with shaking hands. Whisker crept over to sniff at the stranger's cloak before settling by their feet with a purr. "Looks like she likes you," Elias said. The traveler's lips turned up in a small smile, one that disappeared almost as soon as it appeared. As they drank their tea, the storm outside seemed to grow louder, finding every tiny gap in the walls and sending in cold air. The flames in the room wavered, and Elias glanced at the unfinished lanterns. The traveler noticed and looked at the lanterns too, a strange, unreadable expression crossing their face. "I'd better get started," Elias said, putting his cup down. He began searching through drawers filled with everything from old spoons to unpaid bills. Why is it that everything I don't need is right here, but the one thing I do need is always missing? He muttered, pulling out random items. A rusty compass, a button, and an old note that read, "Remember to fix the roof." The traveler's eyes flicked to the note, then back to Elias with a smirk. "Sounds about right," they said. Elias chuckled. "Oh, you have no idea." He thought of the endless list of repairs and unfinished projects that seemed to grow on their own, as if the workshop wanted to keep him busy forever. At last, he found the spool of silver thread he needed and held it up like a trophy, only to see Whisker had batted an important tool under the heavy workbench. With a sigh, Elias knelt down and reached into the dark space. His fingers brushed against something furry. Whisker had followed him, thinking this was a new game. "Not now, you troublemaker," he whispered. Whisker let out a small protest, and Elias came up with a dusty face and the tool in his hand. The traveler laughed softly, surprising both of them. "I haven't laughed in a long time," they admitted, their eyes a bit softer. "We'll stay a while," Elias said. "I'm pretty funny when I'm not covered in lantern dust." He set the tools down and began to work, his fingers moving confidently, even as the wind whistled through the cracks. The lantern frame slowly took shape, ready to hold the glow of moonlight. As Elias worked, a strange cold whisper moved through the room, making Whisker's fur stand up. The lanterns flickered, casting shadows that shifted and swayed on the walls. The air felt heavier, filled with a tension that made Elias pause for a moment before continuing. Elias worked carefully, his hands steady, as he placed the glowing moonbeams into the lantern. He thought about all the times he had made lanterns, each one bringing light to push away the darkness. But tonight felt different. He had to move quickly and stay focused. The moonbeams shone softly, and the jars of stardust on the shelves glittered. The room was calm, with only the sound of the rain and the crackling fire filling the space. Whisker, his curious cat, wandered around, watching Elias and the tiny bits of glowing dust floating in the air. She pounced on a piece of string, batting it across the floor until it rolled near the fire. "Whisker," Elias called out, his voice sharper than he meant. Whisker froze, eyes wide, tilting her head as if to ask, "Did I do something wrong?" But soon she went back to playing, flicking her tail as she batted the string away. Elias shook his head with a smile. "One day, you're going to make me lose all my hair," he said. The traveler, sitting by the fire, watched and smiled a little. They sipped from an old cup. Elias glanced at them wanting to ask a question. The rain tapped steadily on the windows, making the silence feel deeper before he spoke. "Why do you need to go into the forest?" he asked, focusing on another strand of moonbeam. The traveler looked down at their cup, tracing the edge with a finger. "I lost something important there a long time ago," they said softly. "A part of me. I need to find it and bring it back." Elias frowned as he tied off the strand. He remembered his own moments of feeling lost, when hope seemed as thin as the moonbeams he worked with. The rain tapping on the windows matched the traveler's sad words. The room seemed to echo with memories of times when both he and others came searching for answers or lost pieces of themselves. As Elias mixed the moonbeams with the stardust, the lantern's light started to flicker. It dimmed, as if it were struggling against the strong storm outside. Elias frowned and shook the jar, trying to get the last bit of stardust out. The storm outside howled louder, as if daring the light to stay strong. "This feels like trying to get the last bit of toothpaste out," he said with a small smile. Whisker paused and looked at him as if to say, "Really?" Elias sighed and thought, "Who is really in charge here? Me or Whisker?" Whisker, unbothered, sat down and started grooming herself, eyes half closed in contentment. The traveler leaned forward, their face worried. "Will it work?" "It has to," Elias said, though he wasn't sure. He looked around the workshop at the scattered tools, old projects, and nearly empty jars. The storm outside pressed against the walls, and doubt crept into his mind. The shadows cast by the flickering flames danced along the walls, making the room feel smaller, almost as if the storm itself was closing in. Whisker, sensing the tension, jumped on a glowing bit of stardust and sent it rolling across the floor. It slid close to the fire, and Elias's heart raced. "Whisker!" he shouted, grabbing the stardust just in time. He held it tightly, breathing hard, and looked at Whisker's innocent eyes. "You're going to give me a heart attack," he said. The traveler giggled a little, breaking the tense moment. The sound was soft, like a distant memory of laughter from happier days. Elias smiled as he carefully placed the stardust back in the jar. Elias stood up and noticed an old tear-shaped crystal hanging by the window. It swayed slightly in the breeze. He remembered what his grandmother used to say. "A true wish shines with a light that never fades." The words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the old tales she would share during stormy nights like this one. He turned to the traveler and asked, "What do you wish for most?" The traveler's eyes brightened. "To find the light that leads me home," they said, their voice soft and trembling. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if listening. Elias picked up the crystal. It felt cool and familiar in his hand. He held it up, and a warm glow spread through the room, casting away the shadows that had been creeping in. He carefully placed the crystal into the lantern, and the light grew strong and steady. The room felt warm and safe, as if the storm had been pushed back by the glow. The storm outside seemed to pause for a moment, as though it, too, were watching. The room became still and quiet. Elias felt his heart slow as he saw the hope in the traveler's eyes. Even Whisker sat quietly, as if she knew something important was happening. The whispers of the wind faded, and the lantern's light stayed bright, unwavering. Elias took a deep breath, feeling the weight in the room shift. The traveler's gaze was fixed on the lantern, eyes reflecting a mixture of wonder and relief. "This light, it feels familiar," they said, almost to themselves. "Like something I thought I'd lost forever." Elias nodded. "Sometimes the things we lose have a way of finding their way back to us," he said, thinking of his grandmother's stories and the comfort they brought him as a child. The storm outside softened, the fierce wind turning into a gentle breeze that tapped lightly at the window. Whisker stretched and padded over to the traveler, rubbing her head against their leg. The traveler laughed softly and reached down to pet her, their fingers brushing through her fur. For a moment, the room felt brighter, filled with a quiet sense of belonging. Elias stepped back, his hands covered in stardust. He looked at the traveler, who stood up and held the lantern close, as if it held all the answers they needed. The light cast gentle shadows across their face, highlighting the determination that had replaced the worry in their eyes. "Thank you," the traveler whispered. "This isn't just a light. It's a guide. It feels like hope." Elias nodded, feeling a warmth spread in his chest. "Safe travels," he said, his voice steady, filled with quiet confidence. The traveler walked to the door, their face glowing with the lantern's light. They paused for a moment, eyes showing gratitude and old memories stirred by the warm glow. Then they stepped into the rain, and the light shone bright and clear in the dark, cutting through the shadows and guiding their way. Elias watched until the light disappeared into the forest. The storm had calmed, and the rain now fell gently, almost like a lullaby. Whisker jumped onto the table and curled up, her purring filling the room with a peaceful sound. "Some nights are about more than making lanterns," Elias said, petting her soft fur. The heavy feeling in his heart lifted replaced by a sense of peace and hope. He glanced around the workshop, which glowed with the warm light of finished lanterns, their reflections dancing in the jars of stardust. Elias leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the room wrapping around him like an old blanket as the night slowly turned into morning. The storm had passed, and with it, the weight of uncertainty.